This is the final chapter in the State and Local Government online course, Chapter 18 on Environmental Policy. And as we'll see here, as we have throughout the course, we'll have our federalist system at work as far as what the states are tasked to do with environmental policy. So let's look at the objectives that have to be balanced here. States are pretty much have a priority of economic growth, and the corporations that are responsible for providing this economic growth want to maximize their profit and improve development, put people to work. States have share in those objectives as well. But there's also the trade-off with environmental protection. We've been dealing with this for over half a century. As we become prosperous and economically productive, we also have to watch out for pollution, maintain our air and water to be clean and sustainable. And this is where government comes into play because there's not very much economic incentive for corporations to not pollute. So therefore, government has to keep an eye on this, provide regulations in order to protect the environment. Public opinion is, as you would probably expect, it kind of varies depending on the economic conditions. If the economic conditions are very good, then we will start thinking a little bit more about our environment. But if economic conditions are bad, such as in recessions, the priority shifts. We need to get the economy back going, and the environment will take a back seat until the economy recovers. And the idea of self-regulation or self-auditing that is typically lagged behind of traditional government regulation because again there's not a whole lot of incentives to police yourself with environmental protections, beyond what a corporation may think is social responsibility, but obviously it cuts into their profit, so that's not going to be a rational incentive to do that. As you can see, with economic downturns, we notice that you can hear the environment takes a downturn in a recession, as we see right here. Environment takes a downturn, economic growth then becomes more of a priority, then it shifts back. So that's kind of how it works with environmental protections, as we could also kind of correlate this with concern about climate change or global warming as well. So when we look at what the political economy is of environmental protection, we see that it has a trade-off with competition between states for industry in order to provide jobs for that state, to provide economic development for that state. And what we've already touched on this before in our economic development chapter is that the competition for this economic development between states, where they could continuously, potentially keep lowering their environmental standards in order to attract industries to come there, that could result in what we've talked about before as a race to the bottom, where conditions could get continuously worse as far as environmental protections, clean air and clean water, in order to try to keep industries in your state or attract industries to your state. So the public, which lives in the states, tends to prefer the federal government taking the lead on that while the state focuses on economic priorities. Up until World War II, it was primarily a state and local responsibility, but as we get out of World War II, start to see a little bit more centralization because of the economy starting to pick back up, the success of World War II, trust in government, we start to see that more and more legislative acts are enacted to try to get a federal approach to the environment, such as Water Pollution Control Act 48, Air Pollution Control Act 1955, and as we talked about earlier in our stages of federalism, the 1960s and the 70s were considerably more where the federal government was becoming a little bit more proactive, and we have major Clean Air Acts, 1960s, 1970. So this increasing centralization, we still have the states able to compete for economic development, but pollution problems, obviously, particularly with air and water, they don't stop at the state borders. These are not just national, but they're global problems that we would talk about in another class as well. But the inability of states to work together on this makes it more difficult, and then thus obviously requires a little bit more federal government involvement to centralize the environmental protections. We also see that 1/3 of the United States is public land. In other words, owned by either state or federal governments. 60% of 4 states in the West of their entire territory is public land. This gives you a table from the book showing how, for example, 81% of the entire state of Nevada is federal land, 66% in Utah, so you can see those numbers there. Whereas on the other side of that, Connecticut, Iowa, New York, extremely small percentages of the land owned by federal government, so you can see why it would be a little bit more of a sensitive issue in the West, perhaps. The EPA was first formed in 1970 as an executive order by President Nixon, so we see that, yeah, as we get out of the 60s, we're starting to have a little bit more awareness of environmental protections, pollutions, clean air, clean water, and therefore the incentive of federal government to keep an eye on that. There's 10 regional offices around the United States, and because of the less priority on environmental protections, EPA consistently considers itself to have a shortage of funds in order to do what it feels like it needs to do. And so our federalist system here, as we've seen in several other aspects of our society, that the federal government makes the rules, but then lets the states enforce them. We'll look at how the money is split here in a minute, but that's a fairly common aspect of our federalist system. We want the federal government to centralize what the rules are and then let the states take care of that. Now, in 2009, now of course this is going to vary between administrations, but in 2009, the EPA declared greenhouse gases as pollutants, so therefore they could use a little bit more of their regulatory power on monitoring greenhouse gases from the fossil fuels such as CO2 and methane. The current administration has kind of flip-flopped on that and has been challenging those rules to keep the EPA from regulating the fossil fuel industry. Now, as we see so far in our federalist system, that some states go ahead and take action on their own unilaterally. So we see the book gives you a few examples here and there, but we're looking at states tackling their own hazardous waste, enacting their own conservation programs, focusing a little bit more unilaterally on other renewable sources, such as Texas being very prominent in the particularly in the wind industry. Some southwestern states tackling a little bit more unilaterally on solar power. At the same time, there there has to be national standards that are maintained on this to keep everybody on the same page. And so 77% of the state's environmental budgets comes from their own state revenues. So that would certainly inspire a little bit more unilateral action, since the federal government does not pay as big of a chunk as it does on some other types of programs. So looking at the amount spent, we're looking at over $12 billion per year spent by the state and local governments on environmental protection. But looking at that in perspective, that's less than 2% of total state spending. So again, matter of priorities, and some states have their own environmental agencies, and 30% of the states actually exceed the standards that are set by the EPA. So that's where in our federal system, some states take it to another level than what they're actually required to by the federal government. Here's a map that's looking at, and you can check and see in the book how they actually, or go directly to the source to find out how they measure this. But the greenest states here, perhaps in the Northwest, not too surprising there, with Washington, Oregon seeming to be in the lead for the most part in protecting their forests and natural resources there. So that gives you some of the states that are the least green because of various priorities that they may have in those particular states. So locally, governments do what they can, talking about not just states, but then delegated down to the municipalities. They're trying to reduce what we call the ecological footprint, which is what you do that creates pollution or greenhouse gases that add to our social costs. So if you reduce your ecological footprint, you'll lower those social costs. So the local governments are looking at things such as anti-litter campaigns, planting of trees, recycling, composting, conservation efforts, more open space for greenery, and obviously to, in the fight against global warming, reducing greenhouse gases. So when we deal with waste, we've got a lot of it that we've got to deal with. 4.4 pounds per person per day is the amount of solid waste that we produce in America. About 12% of that is burned, which contributes to more pollution. That number has come down. Landfills, we have about 54% of all of our solid waste goes straight to landfills. That requires area, requires zoning to put this waste in some place where people aren't going to be living around it. Recycling or composting, that's around 34%. We'll talk about how difficult that is, particularly with plastic. Now, a common term in environmental politics is called NIMBY, or not in my backyard, and this is where politics gets involved with these landfills and any other type of pollution control areas. That we do not want that in our backyard. We want to take care of our waste, but put it somewhere else. And some cities don't even want it in their, not just in my backyard, but not in my city limits. And so there's lots of cities out there that ship it somewhere else, in some cases hundreds of miles away, into large centralized waste landfill areas that cities can bring their waste to. So 27% of solid waste is paper, which is a little bit easier to recycle. Yard trimmings, 14%, also recyclable. Plastic makes up 1/3 of solid waste, but as we'll see, it has been difficult to recycle plastic, no matter how hard we try. Some municipalities may even be giving up on it to a certain extent, but we do have 9,000 plus curbside programs in the United States where you put your glass, your cans, your plastic, and your paper on the curb for recycling. And again, as a matter of priorities, during a recession, demand for recycling is going to take a dip because of other priorities to try to get the economy back going. Here is a pie chart from the book that shows the breakdown of the solid waste in the United States. This is a study that was done that is a little bit frustrating in that of all the plastic that's been produced since 1950 that is not still in use. So we're looking at this one right here. Of that 5,800 million tons, only 9% of it has actually been recycled. So you can see big chunk of it goes straight to landfill or discarded, and we see a certain amount of it is incinerated. But as far as the amount that's recycled, it will then eventually get incinerated or then eventually go to a landfill as well. And what we see that relatively small portion of it, well, 100 million tons out of that 500 is recycled, still in use. So that gives you just a little chart here showing how difficult it has been to recycle plastic. We can get into that in another course as to why that's difficult. When we look at hazardous waste, we're looking at things like pesticides, motor oil, batteries, paint. I mean, in my lifetime, when I was younger, I used to change my oil in my car, and since it became hazardous waste, it's more conducive to just go ahead and let a dealership or one of these services change your oil, because then they would dispose of it legally as hazardous waste. And the Act of 1976 covers 220 pounds per month, and the Superfund of 1980, some more federal legislation here, was tasked to clean up past pollution. So we weren't keeping up with it for a long time. So then we have to go back and try to clean up areas that have been polluted. So this is what you might call the polluter pays principle, that fees are levied on the manufacturers who are responsible for that past pollution. Now, the Superfund expired in 1995, and because of other priorities, it's been blocked ever since. New Jersey, in fact, has the most of these Superfund cleanup sites on the list. Another effort, what we call brownfields that were tainted by hazardous waste that could not be revegetated. Well, then there's been some efforts to redevelop brownfields as well. As far as the biggest toxic releasers, we see here Alaska, Utah, Nevada, Texas at the top of the list there, as far as states leading in total on and off site release of all industries, all chemicals. Nuclear waste is still and probably will always be a controversial issue, which is also contributed to the fact that the nuclear power industry has not really recovered, particularly since the accidents of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and then of course Fukushima in Japan. The probability of having an accident like that is very small, but when it does happen, it could be potentially catastrophic. So that has put some limitations on or even lack of interest in trying to get the nuclear power industry back up to a percentage where it used to be. But disposing of the waste is also an issue that will always be an issue that we'll have to figure out how to store radioactive waste. It's highly corrosive. Where are you going to store it? What if earthquakes are going to mess with that storage area. Another federal act here in 1980 that made each state responsible for its own nuclear waste. So that puts a little bit more burden on the states. And since that time, we've had less interest and less activity on nuclear power. And interstate compacts, which are a way of what we might call regionalism, trying to get states together to form a regional answer to some of these problems as far as disposing of nuclear waste. And regional would certainly have incentives to take care of a problem in an area where they have common concerns, whereas the federal government could provide some overarching general standards, whereas interstate compacts could focus on a problem more specifically. So the challenges remain: environmental justice, the issue of fairness, where do we put these facilities, people that are exposed to inequities, we might be getting the burden of these. We've already talked about the problems of inequality in our development. If you have toxic waste and it's near low-income communities, so what we've looked at is cancer alleys, increased exposure of minorities. We also see that ecoterrorism is another up-and-coming challenge that radical groups, whether they're environmental, animal rights groups, could do something that could be environmentally related to releasing toxic chemicals or to kind of dismantling a grid that takes care of waste disposal, pollution. These could be driven by several things, to not just to improve the environment, but opposition to corporate profiteering by not focusing on environmental problems. More challenges we've seen, particularly with the pickup of the natural gas industry, which was very much a priority during the recession. To pick that back up, also somewhat of a trade-off to use potentially less oil for energy needs by picking up on the use of natural gas. And so hydraulic fracturing, which is also referred to as fracking, what this does is use high pressure injection with chemicals to break up the rock and release more natural gas. So a few states really saw an economic boom in the particularly in the last decade or so, that is going to shift their priorities on producing more natural gas. And debate is still out there as to, first of all, natural gas is still a fossil fuel and does have some contribution to the greenhouse gases. We've also had some debates over whether or not the fracking process did affect local water wells, things such as that, and to the point where some states have actually banned or imposed guidelines on fracking. And my little brother had used to be living in Oklahoma and had experienced some of these small earthquakes because of the fracking procedure. Has increased the fissures in the underground strata, which has resulted, according to theories, scientific theories, that the increased amount of fracking has contributed to the increase of tiny earthquakes that are just perceptive, have not. Some have created a little bit of a damage, but they're mostly just perceptible tremors and quakes. In 2015, an EPA study finds no link of fracking to systemic pollution. So as long as we see that if it's not a serious threat as far as continuing to find that, well, then obviously the priority of producing it will remain. But debate is clearly still out there as to what the trade-offs are. So this wraps up the final chapter. The final test, of course, is to be taken in the testing center.